All right. So tonight I'm pleased to welcome Maile Meloy to discuss her new collection of short stories, Both Ways is the Only Way I Want It. Of Both Ways, the New York Times writes, though it may seem strange to praise a writer for the things she doesn't do, what really sets Meloy apart is her restraint. She is impressively concise, disciplined in length and scope, and she's balanced in her approach to character, neither blinded by love for her creations nor abusive towards them. Meloy's restraint also comes through not in the way she plots stories, which is boldly, but in how she chooses to reveal her plots, delivering shocking twists in as low-key a manner as possible. And from the Los Angeles Times, in the best short stories by Poe, Raymond Carver, Hemingway, Flannery O'Connor, or Alice Munro, there is always malaise, if not outright heartache, on the horizon. In less able hands, this convention turns lugubrious and contrived. But Meloy's lean, targeted descriptions and her ultimately compassionate eye make this journey hurt so good. Miss Meloy's previous works include the story collection Half in Love, the novels Liars and Saints, and A Family Daughter. Ms. Meloy's work can be seen in publications such as The New Yorker, The Paris Review, and Granta. She received the Paris Review's Aga Khan Prize for Fiction, the Penn Malamud Award, the Rosenthal Foundation Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. We are very thrilled to have her with us tonight, so will you please join me in welcoming Maile Meloy.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I'm always amazed when people show up, but it makes me really happy. I'm going to read a little. Can you all hear me? Yes. Hi, Grace. I'm going to read a little bit, not a whole story, just part of a story, and then talk a little bit, and then I'm happy to answer questions. The story is sort of the one that the book started with, which I'll talk about a little at the end. And it's a Christmas story, which, I don't know, in this weather maybe seems sort of refreshing. It's a period piece in that it's set in 1978 and there are no cell phones. And there's a child in a car who's in no way in a car seat, which I feel like makes it historical fiction. And it's called O Tannenbaum. It was a fine tree, Everett's daughter agreed. His wife said it was lopsided and looked like a bush. But that was part of its fineness. It was a tall, lopsided Douglas fir, bare on one side where it had crowded out its neighbor. The branchless side could go against the living room wall, the bushy side was for decorations, and now the crowded tree in the woods had room to grow. Everett dragged their find through the snow by the trunk, and Anne-Marie, who was 4, clung to the upper branches and rode on her stomach, shouting, "Faster, Daddy!" Pam, his wife, followed with an armload of juniper boughs. She seemed to have decided not to say anything more about the tree, which was fine with Everett. The Jimmy was parked where the trail split off from the logging road, and Everett opened the back to throw the tools and boughs in, then roped the tree to the roof with nylon cords. Pam brushed off Anne-Marie's snowsuit and buckled her in the front so she wouldn't get carsick. The smell of pine and juniper filled the car as they drove down the mountain. Everett sang "Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire" in his best lounge singer croon. With Jack Frost nipping at your nose, he reached over and nipped at Anne-Marie's, and she squealed. He stopped, forgetting the words. Pam prompted, "Yuletide carols," half singing, shy about her voice. He picked up the song again and reached for the high note, and that was when they saw the couple at the side of the road. Folks dressed up like Eskimos. Everett thought for a second that he had conjured them up with his song. The two of them stood in the snow under the branches of a big lodgepole pine. The man wore a blue parka and held up a broken cross-country ski. The woman wore red gaiters over wool trousers, a man's peacoat, and a fur hat. They waved, and Everett slowed to a stop and rolled down the window. "Nice day for a ski," he said. "It was," the man said bitterly. He was about Everett's height and age, not yet pushing 40, with a day or two of bristle on his chin. "I broke a ski and we're lost," the woman began. "We're not lost," the man said. "We are completely lost," the woman said. She was younger than the man, with high pink cheekbones in the cold. Everett felt friendly and warm from the tree and the singing. "Your car must be close," he said. "You're on the road." "The car is on a different road," the woman said. "Well, we'll find it," Everett said. In the rearview mirror, he saw Pam's eyes widen at him from the back seat. Pam was slight and dark-haired and accused him of favoring the kind of blonde who held sorority car washes. It was a joke, but it was partly true. With a bucket and sponge, this girl would fit right in. But arguing over giving them a ride would make everyone uncomfortable, and Pam would agree in the end. Everett got out of the car and untied a nylon cord to open the back hatch. Pam had sleds and jackets in the back seat with her, and he thought she would want some separation of family and hitchhikers. She wouldn't look at him now. You'll have to sit with the juniper boughs, he told the couple. Better than freezing in a snowbank, the blonde said, climbing into the way back. Even in the wool pants, she had a sweet figure, of the car soaping type. We really appreciate this, the man said. Everett shut them all in, lashed on the skis, and tied the tree down. It made no sense for Pam to be angry. This wasn't country where you left people in the snow. The man looked strong, but not too strong. Everett could take him if he needed to. Back in the driver's seat, he pulled back onto the road as snow fell in clumps off the big pine the couple had stood under. His daughter turned around in her seat, as well as she could with her seatbelt on, and announced to the new passengers, "We have a CB radio." The warning tone in her voice came straight from Pam. It was identical in some technical, musical way to Pam's, "We're going to be late," and her, "I'm not going to tell you again." "A CB radio," the man in the parka said. "What's your handle?" Anne-Marie looked confused. "Your name," Everett explained, "on the radio." "Batgirl," Anne-Marie told the strangers, her cheeks flushing. Oh, he loved Anne-Marie, loved it when she blushed. He would never put his wife and child in danger, and he hadn't put them in danger now, and he resented Pam's eye-widened implication that he had. "You got a handle?" he asked the hitchhikers in back. "I'm Clyde," the man said. "Bonnie," the woman said. Everyone was silent for a moment. "That's really funny," Everett finally said, though between his shoulder blades he felt a prick of worry. "You must have a CB too." "No, those are our names," the man said. The CB crackled on. "What's this Continental Divide?" a man's voice asked. Everett picked up the handset, still thinking about Bonnie and Clyde. "You mean, what is it?" "Yeah," the voice said. So Everett explained that the snow and rain on the west side of the mountains ran to the Pacific, and the water on the east side ran to the Gulf of Mexico. "I never heard of such a thing," the voice said. "That's what it is," Everett said. He thought of something, the recruiting of a witness. "We just picked up some hitchhikers named Bonnie and Clyde," he said. "How about that?" A wheezing laugh came over the radio. "No kidding," the voice said. "You watch your back then. So long." Everett hung up the handset. "So," he said to his passengers, as if he hadn't just acted out of fear of them, "where's your stolen jalopy?" "We parked by Fire Creek." "You didn't get far." "No," Bonnie said. "How'd you break the ski?" Bonnie and Clyde both fell silent. Everett drove. The windows were iced from everyone's breathing, and he turned up the defrost. The fan seemed very loud. He took the road to Fire Creek, which was unpaved under the packed snow. "This is it," he said, stopping the Jimmy. There was a place at the trailhead to park cars, but there were no cars. Just snow and trees and the creek running under the ice. Everett didn't look back at his wife. He scanned the empty turnout and hoped this was not one of those times you look back on and wish you had done one thing different, though it had seemed perfectly natural to do what you did at the time. I'll stop there. Thank you. I usually talk a little bit about how this book came to be, but first I feel like I have to talk about how strange it is to be back here. I was an English major at Harvard, and this bookstore is so much a part of my life as a reader at a time when I was sort of figuring out that maybe I wanted to be a writer. So being back here as a writer is really intense. All my friends were going off to medical school, and fancy consulting jobs. This was back when there were fancy consulting jobs for people right out of college. And I had no idea what I was going to do. And I decided I would write a thesis about the literature of the American West, not really understanding that it was something I maybe wanted to be part of, which made it really difficult. And everyone I asked to be my advisor was so bored by the topic that they refused to advise me. And finally, a wonderful PhD candidate agreed to be my advisor and helped me get through it and suggested that I try writing short stories. And I'm so grateful because I don't know that I would have thought to do it on my own. Richard Ford was coming to teach a fiction class, and you had to write a short story to get in. And so I wrote something like a short story, and it instantly felt like what I wanted to do. And so I feel like this, and I wouldn't admit it for a long time because it seemed so improbable as a way to make a living and so sort of presumptuous to say. But I really feel like that year and writing that thesis about the literature of the American West with Neil Kalpern, who was so great, and taking Phil Fisher's 20th century novel class and sort of thinking about 20th century fiction, and then taking this fiction class sort of made it all come together in a way that like I said, I'm really grateful for. And my summer job was as a river ranger for my uncle on the BLM on the Green River in Utah. And it wasn't even really a job. It was sort of a volunteer position with a stipend and like a tiny trailer to live in when you weren't on the river. And I think it attracted a lot of really crazy people. And it just occurred to me this morning when I was thinking about it that my uncle was trying to use me as a buffer against the lunatics who usually showed up to take the free trailer. And I brought a friend, and we went out, and the job was 9 days on and 5 days off. And on the days on, you would go out to this place called Sandwash, which is one of the most remote places in the United States, and live in a double-wide trailer, which is bigger than the free one, and check people on the river in the morning. It was a 5-day river trip through Desolation Canyon, and make sure they had their fire pans and they knew not to touch the petroglyphs. And then they were gone, and you had the rest of the day in this middle of nowhere in the desert with no phone and no internet and no TV and no cell service, and I just sat out there and tried to write short stories. And then when I was off the river, my Aunt Ellen, my uncle's wife, her first book was coming out, and I was staying with them, so I didn't have to stay in the tiny trailer, which seemed to be full of hantavirus anyway. And she was getting reviews sent over the fax machine from her agent, and then her agent came out to visit, and I'd never met a literary agent before. And she would get up at 5 a.m. to write before it got too hot, and she had a side job working for writing catalog copy for Patagonia, which meant she always had great samples of like river shorts and paddle jackets. And it started to seem possible that this was a way you could make a life and a living as a writer. So then I had a bunch of other strange jobs, and I moved to LA, and I ended up in an MFA program, which was really, it's not for everyone, but was really good for me. And I wrote my first book, which is a collection of short stories in that program, and then I wrote 2 novels, and then I was writing another novel, I thought, and Grant, a magazine, called and said that they were going to put me on their list of best young American novelists, and I remembered reading the list. They do it every 10 years, reading it 10 years earlier, and I remembered the pictures in it and the stories, and think never occurring to me that I could be in such a thing. So I was completely thrilled. But the catch was that they needed a short story in a month, and I didn't have any short stories, and I'm really bad at writing them on demand. And so I put aside the novel, and I got out all of the stories that seemed like they might be salvageable, all the sort of abandoned drafts, and I abandoned hundreds of drafts. I mean, there's so many, but these were the ones that seemed like there might be something. I just couldn't get the end to work or something, and it never quite gelled. And some of them I had abandoned for years, but they were just the ones that seemed closest. And I started working on all of them, hoping that one of them would go. And It really always feels like can you get the car in gear? You know, you can have the motor running and it just won't go. So I finished one of them, which was a Christmas story, and Granta didn't care that they were publishing in July. And that was the one that I sent them. But by then I was interested in the other ones, and I feel about going back and forth between novels and short stories that it's kind of like going back and forth between running marathons and sprinting, and you kind of need to get used to the pace again and get those muscles back again. And so from working on these stories, I'd gotten used to the pace again, and so I wrote a couple of new stories. And I had already had maybe 3 that had been in magazines before that were done. And my editor called, and she said she was going on maternity leave, and she wanted to make sure, because I hadn't actually switched publishing houses with her yet, that I wasn't going to have a book while she was gone. And I said, no, gosh, no. And she said, well, what are you working on? And I said, short stories. And she said, how many do you have? And I said, probably a dozen. And she said, that's a book. Send it to me. So suddenly I had this book that I hadn't expected to write, and that I felt deeply ambivalent about, because so many of the stories in it were my problematic stories. And stories that had been hard for me. And it was coming out in the middle of summer, in the middle of a recession, and I just expected it to absolutely vanish. And I also, because I felt insecure about the stories, in putting together the order, I sort of led with the ones that had been in the New Yorker, thinking that it's like playing spades. You lead with your aces, you know, and then you try to slip the sort of 4 of hearts and the 3 of clubs in later. But then people started liking the 4 of hearts and the 3 of clubs, and the book had this amazing reception that I totally didn't expect. And I feel like the moral of the story is not to give up on your reject pile, whatever form your personal reject pile might take. And I feel like the fact that there was something difficult in the stories meant that there was something promising in them. So that's how this book came about. And tools. Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. Avon and Liam and Raina are my cousins. O'Toole's is a bar in Helena, Montana, my hometown. You don't usually look out at a reading and see a T-shirt from it. That's awesome. Hi. So I can answer questions if I used to, when I first started, the bookstore person would say, I think Maile will take questions now, and I would look so terrified that everyone would feel sorry for me and no one would ask anything. But it's gotten easier over time. I make a cup of tea. I get dressed. I make a cup of tea, and then I go straight to work. And I have one of those astronaut chairs that tips back with an arm that comes over it with a laptop on it, because it's much easier on my shoulders. Writing is hard physically, isn't it? It's really hard on your shoulders. So this means that I'm sort of tipped back like that. And I just start working on whatever I'm working on pretty much right away. I used to work at night because I was in college, and that's when you work. And then I went to a reading, and Amy Bender said she works first thing in the morning and does only 2 hours, and then she's done. And I thought 2 hours seems like nothing. But the idea, and I know everyone has said this, you know, Cheever said it, Flannery O'Connor said it, everyone says you just have to be there when it's not working so that you're there when it starts working. And I really feel like that's true, and that first thing in the morning you're fresher and your mind is making more random associations and you're closer, you know, you're not thinking about all the other things. And I know it's a luxury to be able to write first thing in the morning, but it's been incredibly useful to me also to make the time be the requirement and not what you get done. Because for a long time I was like, I'll write whatever needs to be finished. And then after a while I didn't know what was close and what needed to be finished. And so I felt like as long as I'm there working, eventually something will get done. It depends where I am in the project. If I'm sort of toward the end where I'm just kind of sailing through and fixing things, then I can work all day. If I'm at the beginning and it's going really badly, sometimes I'll try for a while, and I'll try writing about why it's not going well for a while, and then I'll just cut my losses and stop. And then sometimes, like especially early, a couple hours I feel like is all I have. When you're really doing that first kind of hard work of getting a book going, I feel like by the middle of the day, I'll start making things worse, and that it's just all the brain I have to work for a couple hours. So it just depends on where I am in the project. I have no other job. Yeah, I know. I feel really lucky, really lucky. I have had other jobs, but not right now. You sort of have a feeling which ones might be still interesting to you. This was how it was for me anyway. And then just sort of read through them. And I feel like time is the great editor. And what happened with those stories is enough time had passed that I could see ways to fix things that I couldn't see to fix before. And also because 10 years had passed, not 10 years, but a lot of years, some of them I had abandoned early on. One, maybe two of them I had abandoned when I was writing my first book of short stories. So I'd written 2 novels in between. And what happened from the time I was first writing short stories to the time I was writing now is I learned to let things go on longer and get a little out of control. And one of the stories that I fixed in here, I just made it go on longer and got past the point that I thought it should end before. And I really feel like that came from writing 2 novels and from growing up a little bit and just seeing like this needs to go further. It needs to have other characters come into it. It needs to go on. But then beyond that, it's just sort of a feeling. And then it's reading it over and over again until nothing stops you anymore. For me, yeah, I'm terribly inefficient. Well, when I was in university, I didn't know what I was doing. But when I was first in graduate school, when I first really knew what I was trying to do, when I knew that I was trying to write short stories, a writer came to talk, and I asked them how you put the stories in order, and she didn't have an answer. And I feel like now I have an answer. You lead with your aces. I mean, it's a more complicated answer than that about how things work together and how you sort of create the experience of a book and how certain stories need to go early and certain stories need to go late. So that's just the question that I had that I know went unanswered back then. Someone once told me, and I think this is really good advice, to read things like Tolstoy that seem huge and amazing and like you could never do that, but it makes writing seem like this hugely important thing in the world. And then to read sort of little novels that make you think, oh, I could do that. And to go back and forth between those two. And it's something someone did tell me, but I think it was really good advice. And read all the time and write all the time. You mean advice for a writer, right? Yeah. Read as much as you can and read as many different writers as you can. I feel like especially if you're a writer who writes dialogue, writers tend to be good mimics. And I think if you read as many different writers as you can, then you won't end up mimicking any one of them. And you sort of find your way into a voice as you're writing at the same time. But yeah, just do both all the time. I get ideas about how to do things from books. I just read a novel called The Stone Diaries that was actually given to me by a dear friend of mine when I was here, and I didn't read it. And I just read it, and I'm kicking myself that I didn't read it because I would have learned so much, and it's so interesting in terms of how it's structured. Such a strange structure, and why didn't I read it? What was I reading? So how to do things come from books, but like how people are and what's interesting to me. You know, what happens between people is always interesting to me, and that happens out in the world every day. Carol Shields, yeah. Sorry. It's not usually because it's so many. There are times when I don't read at all, and I feel like it just sort of comes and goes. And then I go back to it again. There are books that have individual books that have made me feel paralyzed. I read David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, and I stopped writing for like 8 months. I was just completely floored, and I just thought, my brain will not do that. And if my brain won't do that, then what's the point? I mean, it really threw me for a loop. Although I do really feel that if it's not working at all, beating your head against the wall is just going to bum you out. So trying to sort of figure out why it isn't working, reading other kinds of books, it just eventually, I just kept sort of in that I'm finishing the notes on a novel and I'm supposed to be writing a book review. And that is too much for me. I really am so much happier just with one. That time working on the multiple stories was really unusual. I'm usually working on one book only, and I feel like that's all I can, some people work with music on. I feel like my brain cannot do one other thing at the same time. But really, it will pass, I promise. Although I've never read American Rust, now I won't. I have so many, and I can never remember them when I'm asked it. I just wrote a novel that's for kids, and so I was reading all the Philip Pullman books, and I think he's fantastic. But that's just sort of a recent thing. The Stone Diaries I thought was amazing, but I'd never read her before. I feel like books come into your life and they go, and it's just too hard to pick favorites. Cheever, when I was writing stories, I really wanted a bracelet that said, "What would Cheever do?" And I, read all those books, those stories, and still have them so much in my head. The Wapshot Chronicle was hugely useful to me, Cheever's novel, when I was writing Liars and Saints, because it was a family story told from different points of view, people in the family, and it rotated between them, and it just made me feel like, okay, what I'm doing might be a novel. Philip Roth I read almost all his books in a year. I just couldn't stop. I don't know if I recommend them. There's a writer named Mercè Rodoreda, who's a Catalan writer who was really useful to me when I was writing Liars and Saints. Also, it's, her book, The Time of the Doves, is set during the Spanish Civil War, and it's very innocent female voice in wartime, and I think that was really useful to me in writing Liars and Saints. Flannery O'Connor's stories, I think, just blow me away still. There are a million that I'm not thinking of. It's just too hard a question. I'm almost always reading as a reader. Every once in a while I think, oh, I'm noticing structure. And I'm very proud of myself. But yeah, I totally read as a reader. I've been reading, because I've been reading these young adult books. I just read When You Reach Me and Will Grayson back to back. And I don't know if you've read them, but they're two sort of new young adult books, and they're fantastic. And I just felt like, oh, I'm so happy. I feel like reading when I was 12. There's no, I like just reading for reading. Because I just wrote this book for kids, and I felt like, and my Australian publisher sent me all their young adult books and said, here, look at all these great young adult books. And then I felt like I should read these. Just as I'm editing it, just sort of, this book is set in 1952, and it's not really like, and the girl's 14, and apparently for young adult, the main character has to be 16. I'm learning all these marketing rules. But it's sort of it's very different from these contemporary books, because it's basically a Cold War thriller with kids and magic. I never have the idea what I'm doing. I usually start with sort of a kind of charged situation, but it's usually not more than a sentence. I read a story that's about a family out cutting down a Christmas tree, and they pick up some hitchhikers, and I started with the cutting down of the Christmas tree, which is a thing we used to do when I was a kid, but I had no story to do with the cutting down of the Christmas tree. It just seemed interesting and promising, and so they put the Christmas tree on the car, and then they're driving down the road, and I really feel like the hitchhikers sort of appear as they appear in the story, and I think, okay, well, I have to pick up the hitchhikers. So you pick up the hitchhikers, and then I got sort of interested in the CB radio, and someone asks them what their handle is, and they say their names are Bonnie and Clyde. And it's really as I'm going along. I mean, sometimes this isn't always true. Sometimes I have a sense of where the story is going to go, for short stories, novels now. But those ones go much faster. But this is the way I usually go. So their names are Bonnie and Clyde. That seems interesting and sinister, so I'll just keep going with it. And I know I'm not going to write an axe murderer story, but there's going to be this kind of axe murderer frisson about this. So what is it about this couple they pick up that's going to be interesting and challenging and life-changing for the people who pick them up? And then I just keep going, and I really feel like you sort of stand the characters up and let them talk, and then you follow where it goes, and then you revise and revise and revise. But that generally is sort of how it goes for me. And I never write an outline. I have a friend, and I've been saying this forever, that I have a friend who outlines her whole novels in her head before she starts writing, but she just told me that she doesn't. I'm very disappointed, because I always thought, wow, that would be so efficient. I would be so much faster then. No, I go forward like I'm in a dark room feeling for the walls. I have no idea where it's going, even with a novel. And then I get to the end and I have this thing, and then I go back and shape and think about it. And, I wrote a novel that was set over 60 years. So I went back and thought about what was happening in America during that time, and who was president, and what was going on, and what it was about, and how it was about the second half of the 20th century challenging this family and what they were sure about. And that part I'm going back and sort of thinking about things, but as I'm going forward, I wish it were otherwise, because I feel like it would be faster, but I feel like I'm building the bridge I'm walking on as I'm walking on it. Because my friends had a movie idea, and they thought it should be a book first, and they tried writing it as a novel and realized, oh, this isn't what we do. And so they told me the idea, and I started writing it, and I thought, this is fantastic. What have I been doing, trying to come up with my own stories? This is great. And I was also in between books. I feel like I just finished this one, and so I was kind of I think there's sort of a natural lull where the well's filling up again and you don't have anything else. And this came in that time, and I thought, great, I'm not doing anything else. So I wrote, 20 pages, and I said, okay, what happens next? And they said, we don't know. And I thought, oh. And then I just kept going, and it's been really, really fun, and not something I would have thought of doing on my own again. I need a little push, obviously, but it's been great. And it's set up for a sequel. I sort of feel like halfway through it, I got my own idea for a grown-up novel at the natural time, and then I was working on this other thing, and I can't do two things at once, so I was sort of frustrated for a while, but I think I'll probably write another grown-up novel next. And then I wrote A Family Daughter, and I didn't know when I was writing Liars and Saints that I was going to write A Family Daughter. I wrote two novels. They both have the same characters in them, but they are kind of parallel universes. And I wrote the first one never thinking I was going to write about the Santerres again. And then part of it was a publishing thing where I wrote my first book, Half in Love, was a collection of short stories, and it took 2 years to come out. And so I wrote Liars and Saints during that time. And I never had the experience of having a book out, which I highly recommend. It's fantastic. Like, as long as you can stay in that little world where you are by yourself, stay there. But so Liars and Saints came out, and I suddenly felt like I had this, I knew, you're always as a writer sort of casting about for what you know, and I felt like I knew something about having a novel out, which is not something that had ever interested me in any way before. But the idea of someone in this kind of secret-keeping family writing a novel started to seem interesting, and the character who was most likely to do it was dead. But I thought, well, it's a novel. I can bring her back to life. So I did, and started this book that was everything I'd written had been really realistic. And so I was writing this book that had this metafictional aspect if you read it in conjunction with the other book, but not if you didn't. I really wanted it to stand on its own and for you to be able to read them in either order. But what I wanted, basically in the second book, the first book is a novel that someone writes. And so I wanted the second book to sort of feel like the kind of messier real-life material out of which the more streamlined Liars and Saints was made. And it made it really interesting to me. Like, it was the same family, but it was doing this kind of thing with my head that I hadn't thought of doing. But then I was really done. Benign neglect. My brother's in the band The Decemberists and writes all their songs and is the lead singer. I don't know. I mean, we did spend a lot of time entertaining ourselves.
Are your parents like, well, how did this happen? Or are they like, this is a natural progression?
They're a little baffled, but I think, especially in my dad's family, the art was just something you did. It was like a natural part of life. My grandfather's brother was a painter and went off to New York, and my grandfather And he was a lawyer and a judge, my grandfather, but he directed plays and made pottery. The two of them, when there was a drought and there was nothing to do on the ranch, before he even went to law school, they would make pottery and they would make glazes, and there's still a glaze called Meloy Black. And they tried to fire it in the blacksmith kiln, but it totally melted it. So they went to the local brickyard and they asked if they could use the brick ovens, and they started making pottery in the brick ovens. And now there's like this huge ceramic center in Helena that all these people come from all over the world to come make pottery there, and it's all because they were bored because there was nothing to harvest. And my grandmother wrote for the local paper. My uncle was in a band, and my dad takes amazing photographs, but it was always something you do on the side. It was never something that, and the uncle, who was a painter, basically died because he was living in this freezing flat in New York. And so I feel like he was this sort of object lesson about trying to make a living as an artist. And everyone felt strongly that you should do so. And my grandparents really, who were these sort of arty people, really thought I should be a scientist because we needed women in the sciences. And, none of them were remotely interested. And I still sort of feel like that, like, science smart is smarter. And that I should have gone to med school. So I feel like they encouraged it as a thing that you did, but not as a job. And then there was a while when my brother was working in a pizza shop and in a band, and I was trying to write short stories, and none of them had been published, and my sister wanted to be a musical theater actress, and my dad was just like, oh my God, one of my children needs to get a job. Someone said, and I don't know who it is, that to write write period things, you need to read 2 books and close your eyes. There's a great book called Austerity Britain, 1946 to 1951. It's about England after the war. It's set in London, the book, and it's fantastic. It's all contemporary accounts. There was this thing I didn't know about called mass observation, where it was like a big sociological experiment where they just wanted people to write down ordinary things that happened in their lives. So some of it comes from that, some of it comes from sort of memoirs, some of it comes from oral histories, but it's all contemporary accounts of what happened after the war. It's totally fascinating. So I just read all of that and then kind of started. And I'd actually just read that anyway, so it was really just lucky. And then read some sort of Cold War stuff. It's a poem by A.R. Ammons that I'd always liked. It's wonderful. I actually learned it from my thesis advisor, who told me to write short stories, who's a poetry critic. One can't have it both ways, and both ways is the only way I want it. It's just 2 words on a line. And it was always there in one of the stories. One of the characters thinks of it. I'm really bad at titles, and my editor always comes up with like 100 of them. And my poor editor. And they told me when I published my first book that I needed to have simple titles because no one was ever going to be able to remember my name or pronounce it or walk into a bookstore and say it. So I had Half in Love, Liars and Saints, and A Family Daughter. I had these really simple 3-word titles, and I really thought I needed another one. And so when she suggested this one, I thought, no, it's too long. But then I realized how much it brought the stories together and sort of brought something, made the book more than it was almost by bringing out this theme that was already there in all of them that I just hadn't realized. Yes. In so many ways I want it both ways. But yeah, and I do like going back and forth between the two. Flannery O'Connor that said that writing short stories after a novel was like a vacation in the mountains. Although I just tried to write a short story after writing a novel and it wasn't true at all. But I do like going back and forth. 13 and a half. It's about a girl who, I haven't been repeating the questions and I was supposed to. It's okay? Okay. Oh, I forgot. It's about a girl, it's just sort of about being 13 and that's always interesting to me. Iris Murdoch novels always have these sort of ruthless teenage girls in them, and I love that kind of character. And that girl's not that ruthless, but the question is about different settings and how the region informs the characters, right? I've been thinking about this recently. I feel like setting is always the given for me. A story has to take place in a certain time, in a certain place. That story has to take place in Montana in the wintertime because that's where you cut down Christmas trees and pick up strangers with broken skis. And because it's the given, I include almost none of it in the first draft, and I tend to start with dialogue and have these really stripped down first drafts, and then I have to go back in and put in the setting enough so that people can see it. But like long descriptions of trees, if the trees don't have anything to do with the story, is driving me absolutely insane. Like I feel like the setting is absolutely essential, and it's so boring to me that I put in almost none of it. So it's like the thing without which the story couldn't exist, and I have to force myself to go and put it in. I feel like Montana is the place I have the sort of deepest vocabulary of detail, because I grew up there. So one of the stories that didn't work in here, the way I made it work is I moved it to Montana, and suddenly I had things to put into it that I hadn't had before. Some of the stories are set in Utah because I was living there and because I felt like there were interesting things about this place. And I think when I started, there's that thing called Stendhal syndrome where people get kind of dizzy in cathedrals, and I have that in bookstores. I just get kind of overwhelmed, and I feel like that was sort of my way of dealing with that overwhelmed feeling of walking into a bookstore and thinking, how can I possibly have anything to contribute to this, was that there was a kind of American West, a kind of version of Montana that I didn't see in books that I felt like I understood and could provide, which is this little tiny thing, but it made me feel like, okay, I have something I can do here. But then I got really tired of it. I got really tired of the Western voice, and I got just sick of it, and I wrote a story about a 70-year-old Frenchman walking around Paris, and I got it completely wrong. I had him walk from a place he could not walk to another place, and no one noticed. But it was really just because I was tired of my own voice. And yeah, I make things up a lot. And I think that's sort of my natural tendency, and that I, in fact, have to add stuff. Someone asked me if I cut out the flowers, and I feel like I never have flowers. And I have a really strong feeling about what beautiful prose is, but it's always about rhythm for me. It's not about ornamentation. And I feel like when I'm reading things where I feel like the rhythm is off, it's like watching someone dance not hearing the music or something. And so I feel like I read my own work until nothing stops me, until I don't have that feeling of the rhythm being off. But I don't tend to strip things out to make it leaner. If anything, I have to add things in to make it less lean.